Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Kids Independent Media Production. Today we are continuing our drum sounds through the decades with one of my absolute favorites, the 80s studio sound. There are a lot of aspects to this, and as we're getting through these decades, it's becoming more and more a sort of, we're not going to be able to hit everything that was in the 80s. So we chose our favorite here, which is this introduction of very compartmentalized, punchy, clear, mixable drum sounds that we associate with pop music, rock music, and most everything that I hear on the radio, especially if I'm listening to classic rock that's heavily 80s. Now, before we dive into all that, we would love to express a very special thanks to all of the members of our Patreon who are making this and many of our episodes possible. Currently, we are relying on the Patreon to allow us to continue bringing you this content and experiment with all of these things that we have here. And it really is the best way to connect with us and other artists that you might be excited about right now and make sure that you can help to facilitate the things that they do that get you excited about music. For example, today, there's going to be complete playing examples that are not featured in this episode over on the Patreon. There are going to be, and this is really exciting, several examples that will include the type of production that would go on top of these kinds of drum sounds back in the 80s that would bring it toward the kind of sounds that you'd expect to hear on the radio, which, if you've been with us, we never affect things in the actual episodes. So if you want to hear production on top of these drum sounds, the Patreon is the place to go. Additionally, the Patreon is where our cymbal series lives. It's exclusive to the patrons there. And there are levels there that give you access to many different parts of the things that we do here beyond just making these episodes that you see on YouTube. Whether you've been watching us for years, it's been years, or you just started watching us today, if you love what you're seeing, if this is helpful to you, please follow the link below. See if there's a level that's right for you to help facilitate us continuing to do this, grow the channel, and bring you more exciting videos like this one. In the 80s, we start to see a larger prevalence of programmed drums, drum machines, mixtures of drum set performance with drum machines, and overall a lot more production in general on records. The idea of a studio sound for drums, or something that we might come to associate with studio sounds, is an organic outgrowth of more microphones, more technology, mixing a lot of different technologies together, coupled with technology in drums themselves getting more and more sophisticated, different kind of like mountings and different sorts of pedals, more advanced drum heads. Everything was blowing up at this time. When you think about seminal drummers, it's easy to listen to drummers before that player came onto the scene, listen to that player, and then listen to everyone who came after to see the profound influence that they might have had. Today we're talking about Steve Gadd. He was one of those for me. He was one of those for most of us. And he went through a few kind of notable sounds through the years, but we are focusing on the period in particular where he was playing standard sized drums, hydraulic batters, a muffled snare with a ring, punchy bass drum, dry cymbals, basically like a blueprint for what you would think of as a studio sound in this era. Now let's hear each of these sounds individually. Now, we mentioned earlier that what we're looking for here is very compartmentalized sounds. What that means is not a ton of sustain, good amount of resonance, they're warm sounding, but overall things are punchy and then they're getting out of the way so that we have a lot of clarity when we start to put a lot of production on top of these sounds. This results in choices like we made today, which is hydraulic batters on all of the toms, standard reso heads, nothing special going on there. And we're also using an ordinary coated batter for the snare, but with an E-ring on there to eliminate overtones and give us the ability to get a warm, short sound out of that drum to go along with everything else. Finally, for the bass drum, we're using an EMAD batter, which we use often, that gives us a punchy sound, but there is also a pillow inside of the bass drum and a ported front head. In this era, you see a lot of large center ports, offset ports, similar kind of behavior. If anything, a large center port's going to dry that out even more, but suffice to say, we want each of these to kind of live in its own space, and whether we do a slow fill or a fast fill, whatever it is, we're hearing each sound very clearly, and then it dies away. A moment to touch on cymbals. In this era, Gadd was using very dry ride cymbals, 18-inch ones. We don't have any dry 18 inches here, but we are using a modern equivalent K Custom Special dry ride. It's a 21-inch. Very similar behavior, dry stick sound, very dry crash sound, and a really musical, warm, and kind of like sprightly bell sound. Additionally, to also stay in this Gadd vein from that era, he used then and often uses now an old Zildjian K top hi-hat from way back in the day. I'm not sure how old it is, but it's old. And then various modern cymbals underneath. So we're using a copy of an old K on top here and a new beat on the bottom. Now, once we've chosen our drum heads and we've gotten into an idea about what we want them to sound like in our heads, have to dive into the tuning. This is where the hydraulic heads and also the E-ring to a certain extent get us where we need to go. The tuning on the reso heads on the entire kit, absolutely ordinary, middle of the road. There's nothing special going on there, and there's no muffling or tape or anything on any of the resonant heads. However, the interesting thing about hydraulic heads is that the average drummer out there, I think, has their own association about what they can do. And when I talk to people about them, they often tell me that they are dead, that they're one-dimensional, that they are boxy, that they are boring. They have a lot of negative associations with them, which is bananas to me because I find them to have a huge range. And in fact, when I first tuned up the drums today, these sounded too normal. We actually had to start to tune them down and then down some more and then down some more and record them over and over again to discover just how low these drummers in the 80s were actually tuning these drums to get them into this realm where they're almost behaving like little bass drums. If you've ever heard the concept of jaw tuning or just above a wrinkle tuning, which generally is associated with bass drums, that's essentially what's going on here. We have the resos in normal range, didn't really mess with them at all, but these heads, if you press on them with a finger or a hand or a fist, there are wrinkles around the edge. This is what we need in order to have these shorter sounds that aren't going to sing for days, so that when we zoom around the toms, they're super clear and they get out of the way immediately. One thing to note if you're going to go after tunings like this on your toms, whether it's with hydraulics or whatever your head of choice might be, is that when you're tuning this low, there's a possibility for starting to get some growl and kind of unusual overtones out of the toms. And depending on where you stand in the room, you may hear it more or less. You may be noticeable in the drums when you're sitting at them, but then not really getting into the microphones. It's a weird thing that sneaks up sometimes. So whether you're recording or playing live or just experimenting, watch out for situations where there's a sound in the tom that you don't want that is particularly starting to show up after you've been playing for a few minutes. We've had that happen here and then ended up re-recording it a little bit later on, but it's particularly common with very low tunings because there's not a lot of tension on there, so they're going to change under hitting a little bit as they settle in. Now with the snare, we still want to have the snare response, and we still want to have the nice comfy rebound and maybe also the coating, for instance, on the batter if we need to do some brush stuff at any point. So rather than putting a hefty head like a hydraulic on there, we're going with a standard coated G1 and putting an E-ring on there to give us a similar sort of quelling of overtones, shortening of the sustain, punchiness in the center, and a really great sound in particular in the center of the drum with the butt of the stick without catching the rim. Finally, with the bass drum, frankly, if you're using a ported front head, you're using any modern batter head, and you put a pillow, like a bed pillow in there, you're going to end up with something in this realm. Compared to some other tunings, this is a one-dimensional tuning. It does one thing, it does it really, really well. Depending on how you actually tune the heads before you put the pillow in there, you may find a little bit more dynamics and tone shift from really slamming it to playing it softer, and it is worth exploring that too, even if you know you're going to put a big pillow in there. In terms of making music today, there are a lot of opportunities to use sounds like this, whether it's in a retro kind of intentional throwback kind of vibe, or just in any kind of musical scenario where you want punchy short sounds. I've seen a lot of hydraulics come up in gospel chops kind of situations. I've seen a lot of world music use these as well when you're attempting to get just something that's a little bit further away from standard modern drum set sounds. Additionally, tuning them into a normal range is a whole other set of possibilities that can be super fun, especially distributing different tunings around the kit. For instance, having the high toms be tuned up and then have the floor tom tuned very low. You can really move through a lot of different things that aren't going to, again, just give you the expected sound out of a modern kit. If jumping into a new style of head and spending the money to make that happen is not something that you're ready to do right now, you can get into this realm of sound just by making slight modifications to the heads that you're using right now. Probably the easiest one that is still a little bit of a purchase but not super crazy is getting E-rings for your toms. They come in different widths, they come for most sizes, and it'll start to take you into that direction of really, again, shortening and punchifying the sound of all of the toms into this realm where they are more like little bass drums and they die really quickly before you move on to the next one. I've taped moon gels to them. I've done different things that just add mass to the edge to slow down and quell the overall behavior of the drum. Some of these things don't even require extreme tuning, but if you want to get into the very, very low tuning and stay punchy without wild overtones and things shifting around, we do have to add mass to the head in some manner and also experiment with just how low we can go before the head starts to give way, start to growl, and do stuff that we don't want. Steve Gadd wasn't the only drummer in the 80s that was going after these kinds of drier, punchier sounds. If you listen to, Toto, or you listen to Tears for Fears or Journey, or a lot of things that were at that kind of level of radio play, it was getting really popular to try to get your drums to sound like this. That doesn't mean that they were all using hydraulic heads or that they were necessarily tuning to this exact kind of scheme to do it. It has much more to do with the character and the way that they wanted the drums to blend into the tracks that they were working on. If you'd like to hear some examples of drum sounds that live in this kind of auditory space, there's a list below in the description of the video of songs that just gave us some ideas about what we wanted to do with this today. this, like a lot of these decade videos, really tell us a lot about how the sounds of the instrument were evolving, the needs of the music were dictating changes in the instrumentation and the sound of these instruments, and also influencing the drummers in terms of what they were doing with tuning, heads, the overall dynamics that they were using. It was all changing, but every single decade also has something that's cool for us to integrate into what we're doing today, no matter what sort of music we're making. And there's nothing funner than taking something old, finding a new context for it, giving it life again, even if it's something as simple as like putting hydraulic heads on your toms. With that said, thanks so much for watching and bringing your attention to another decade of drum sounds. We had a lot of fun today. Please like, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you hear about new videos. And most importantly, if you haven't already, as we mentioned before, please follow the link below to the Patreon. It is what is allowing us to keep making these videos. And the more support we get there, the more videos we can make, and the more of your requests can be fulfilled. It's the best way to directly influence what happens on the channel, and this video, like many of them, completely reliant on the patrons. So check that out. And lastly, tell us your hydraulic head stories. Tell us your 80s drum sound favorites. We would love to know.